Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the nightmare that buried the entire Tudor dynasty. Edward VI, the only legitimate son of Henry VIII, was once hailed as England's future, crowned at 9. But behind that crown lay years of disease, manipulation, and a death so chilling many history books erase it. He never knew childhood games, only fed on divine right theory and religious zeal. Picture, a candlelit palace, anguished screams echoing down the halls, a scene so bone-chilling even Henry VIII would shudder. You won't survive this story if you just skim through it, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is in your local time zone. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Edward VI was born in the year 1537, at a time when music and cheers echoed throughout London and the royal palace. After more than 2 decades of contention for the throne, Henry VIII was finally granted a legitimate son, a moment of unbridled joy. Yet only 12 days later, Jane Seymour, his gentle consort and Edward's birth mother, was stricken ill and succumbed, leaving the boy adrift in the cold corridors of the court. From his earliest days, Edward VI never knew the simple peace of childhood. Instead of running in the gardens, he was wrapped in sumptuous silk robes and accompanied by the unceasing applause of courtiers and attendants. The scent of fresh grass and the chirping laughter of neighborhood children became distant memories. He only felt the rhythm of court music and the tolling of ceremonial bells resonating through the halls, making the candlelit splendor all the more suffocating. Unlike his elder sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who endured their father's sternness, Edward VI received boundless affection from his father, Henry VIII. Seemingly in his later years, sought to compensate for the hardships imposed on his daughters by pouring all his grace upon his only son. That love, however lavish, invisibly tightened the golden cage of royal favor around his tender heart, causing him to lose the simple joys of childhood delight in play, or even fear of the dark. From the very first dawn of his life, Edward stood before a tall mirror, draped in silken garments, wearing a tiny crown, and seated upon an imaginary throne in the grand hall, devoid of peers his own age. He would watch his reflection drift across the window panes, wondering whether he was a child or a future king. The opulent attire and elaborate ceremonies only underscored the gulf between him and the outside world, portraying Edward as the embodiment of a sacred destiny rather than an ordinary boy. The burden of a nation-saving mission pressed upon Edward like a mountain. He was repeatedly reminded that he alone shone as England's beacon, its talisman against every peril. The admiring gazes of courtiers, soldiers, and the royal family fixed upon him, laying an invisible weight upon his fragile heart. When night fell and the palace quieted, the harp's melody faded, and Edward VI lay alone on his silk-draped bed, his ragged breathing echoing through the vast chamber. This marked the beginning of a tragic journey. The innocent boy's heart was gradually filled with loneliness and a thirst for power. From that moment, the cradle of prestige did more than nurture. It shackled Edward's soul within the whirlpool of fate, foreshadowing the thorny path he would be compelled to tread. From the moment he turned 9, Edward entered a unique educational world crafted by his father, Henry VIII. It was no broad, nurturing curriculum for a growing boy, but rather an unyielding regimen, steeped in doctrine. Latin and Greek functioned as mere window dressing for lessons on divine authority and the triumph of the Reformed faith. John Chake, Edward's principal tutor, wore the robes of a scholar, but preached like a zealot, instilling in the young prince harsh indictments against the Catholic Church and unwavering loyalty to the crown. Every subject from history to philosophy to statecraft was filtered through an anti-Catholic lens, teaching Edward that to challenge the Church was to challenge God himself. This ironclad instruction delivered with military precision, became the foundation of Edward's emerging authoritarian nature. Before he even reached 8 years of age, he could expound intricate theological arguments, justifying the elimination of Catholic heretics to preserve spiritual purity. The stark truth was that while his mind was honed to razor-sharp focus, his capacity for friendship or empathy lay dormant. Instead of classmates and playmates, he lived among deferential nobles, velvet-clad courtiers and silken-gowned ladies in waiting, who recorded and praised every word and gesture. There were no carefree laughs beneath summer trees, only the echo of applause and the solemn chime of chapel bells. This odd combination of rigorous scholarship and emotional isolation forged a character unlike any other. Edward's intellect thrived, absorbing every doctrine and decree, yet his heart remained ensnared behind gilded bars. He learned the burden of sovereignty long before he felt the comfort of camaraderie. Simple joys chasing butterflies, splashing in puddles gave way to the cold satisfaction of ideological victories. The boy, who should have been coaxed to giggle in the nursery, was instead drilled in the strictures of Scripture, each phrase weighed for doctrinal precision. Within this crucible of strict dogma and royal favour, Edward's nature took shape into something formidable. The very throne that symbolised comfort and adoration became his cage, sharpening his resolve to wield unchallenged power. Daily lessons drew him deeper into a reality where mercy equated to weakness and dissent to sacrilege. In the glow of candlelit rooms, with quill in hand and theological treatises before him, the young monarch absorbed ideas that would chill his spirit. Thus, the seeds of tyranny were planted in a child too young to grasp their weight. His brilliance grew alongside an emotional void, two forces that would define his brief but unforgettable reign. In every hush of a chapel hymn and every echo of a tutor's lecture, Edward's destiny was forged, an existence caught between scholarly rigour and solitary exile, foreshadowing the shadowed path he was destined to tread. In the autumn of 1547, with the passing of Henry VIII, the English crown descended upon Edward VI. A child of mere 9 years, a regency council, headed by the Duke of Somerset, initially promised balanced governance and peace between warring religious camps. Yet within the silent splendour of the Privy Chamber, the young king's fervour quickly defied those hopes. At his very first council session, Edward rose from his gilded seat as though reclaiming what was rightfully his, cutting off veteran ministers to preach the tenets of the Reformed faith. His clear, solemn voice left no room for dissent. Any suggestion of compromise with Rome drew his stern rebuke, and the assembled elders fell into uneasy silence, as if chilled by an unseen wind. By the glow of candles each morning, Edward would study heavy Protestant treatises before the council convened. He would place his small hand upon the lectern and declare that tolerance of Catholic rituals was tantamount to rebellion against God. His arguments, lifted directly from Scripture and flavoured by his tutor's zeal, astonished even the most hardened nobles. Some recalled gentler reigns of the past, while others remembered harsh persecutions. But none could recall hearing such unbending conviction from one so young. It became clear to all this boy ruler, younger by 16 years than many monarchs, embodied the very essence of uncompromising power. Only a few weeks after his solemn anointing at Westminster Abbey, Edward asserted even greater authority. He insisted on sitting in on judicial sessions, his tiny hand stamping verdicts beside the Great Seal. The court records from that first month are unnerving. They bear his signature approving death sentences for those deemed heretics. Witnesses later whispered of the eerie sight, Edward smiling as he pressed the crimson wax into the document, green candlelight dancing across his pale features. When an advisor dared propose a lighter sentence for a penitent Catholic noble, Edward erupted in what courtiers would call a religious tantrum. He hurled his inkpot across the oak table, ink splattering silks and panelling alike, crying, "Mercy is betrayal," his voice echoing ominously against the cold stone. That episode marked a definitive turning point. The dreamy scholar vanished, replaced by a sovereign who knew no bounds. Within days, the young king's private ledger swelled with the names of those he had condemned for forbidden worship. Each night, Edward would retreat to his silken bedchamber, where muffled wails drifted down the corridors like a grim lullaby. There, in the hush of his loneliness, he listened with half-closed eyes, almost lulled by the rhythm of fear and dominion intertwined. The opulence of his youth, so lavish yet utterly isolating, deepened his reliance on power as the only steadfast companion. Edward VI's cruelty did not stop at ink and parchment. He was captivated by the very instruments of torment. In the quiet wings of the palace, attendants would occasionally come across his secret drawings, precise blueprints of iron grips, barbier blades, slender lashes, and weighted manacles, each accompanied by meticulous observations on how effectively they broke both body and will. While other boys his age might have raced through sunshine-dappled courtyards or chased noisy balls, Edward retreated into a world of chilling manuals on the Spanish Inquisition and transcripts of savage interrogations. His fascination was not dismissed as odd. Rather, it was heralded as proof of his divine mission to eradicate heresy. By the guttering light of his chamber's lone lamp, the young monarch's room became a quiet workshop of torment. The only sounds were the soft rustle of vellum and the occasional drip of wax from half-melted candles. Edward would follow the etchings of drawn instruments with a gentle fingertip, imagining their cold edges cutting into pliant flesh. Behind his half-lidded, drowsy gaze, a spark of grim delight glimmered, as if he conversed silently with each schematic, each promising the sweet taste of unchallenged authority. In his mind, these contraptions were not grotesque curiosities, but holy instruments, chosen by Providence to preserve England's spiritual purity. Beyond his door, the palace hummed with life lieutenants, tuned across marble halls. Courtiers whispered greetings, and servants hurried about their duties. Yet amid this tapestry of courtly bustle, Edward's private obsession stood out like a lone candle in a storm. His tutors, impressed by his fervour, lauded his study of these macabre texts as evidence of heavenly favour. To doubt his grim scholarship, they reasoned, would be to doubt God's hand in his reign. Thus, the boy king emerged as both theologian and would-be inquisitor, consuming dusty tomes instead of childhood rhymes. Edward's cruel instincts soon spilled from drawing to deed. One afternoon, a young page accidentally knocked over a goblet of deep red wine onto the prince's precious dispatches. The boy, King's sleepy eyes snapped open, and in a tone quieter than a whisper yet sharp as steel, he issued a command that sent a shiver through the servants. The unfortunate page was dragged into the courtyard and told to stand immobile as guards and eunuchs flung handfuls of rotten fruit, mouldy bread, and festering scraps at him for uncounted hours. Meanwhile, Edward lounged on a velvet cushion, his posture languid, his gaze heavy-lidded, as if examining a curious specimen under glass. He noted every flinch and tremor, recording each reaction as though conducting a grim scientific trial. In the margins of his leather-bound journal, Edward meticulously scored the sting of spoiled grapes, the splatter of soured milk, and the bruising blow of crusted rolls. He sketched crude diagrams showing angles of attack, mapping the geometry of humiliation itself. To him, mercy had become a stain on his sacred duty. Compassion was a loosened chain that threatened to undermine the absolute authority he was destined to wield. And so he banished pity from his repertoire, convinced that only fear could sustain his vision of a righteous kingdom. Night after night, Edward lay sleepless, cocooned in rich silks, his ears tuned to the distant echoes of despair, drifting down deserted corridors. In the hush, he drifted into a drowsy dreamscape, envisioning grand assemblies where he would pronounce harsher sentences, deliver grana denunciations, and elevate his decrees above any flicker of doubt. The mournful echoes of suffering served as a lullaby, lulling him toward a fitful slumber a paradoxical comfort born of isolation and unchallenged command. If dreams came, they were not of playground merriment, but of cold chains and the glint of steel instruments under flickering torchlight. Meanwhile, behind ornate screens in the Queen Dowager's apartments, the regents exchanged anxious glances. They had prayed that this boy king might mature into a balanced leader, tempered by mercy as well as might. Instead, they witnessed his dark predilections flourish, unchecked. Even the Duke of Somerset dared not confront Edward's grim experiments, for to question the prince's curiosities seemed equivalent to challenging divine right itself. Thus the council's guidance was silenced. Subdued under the twin weights of princely temper and heavenly mandate, as winter's chill crept through the palace gardens, Edward's obsession only deepened. He procured new volumes on medieval torture chambers, obscure manuscripts translated from distant Latin, and ordered craftsmen to fashion miniature racks and iron cages. These he displayed in a private gallery that he visited each day with solemn reverence. Courtiers whispered that the collection resembled a macabre toy, set each piece a testament to pain rather than play. By early spring, those who ventured near the prince's quarters learned caution. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air, and the floors were speckled with stray flecks of ink and wax. Edward's gaze, when it met theirs, was at once languid and piercing, as if seeking any spark of defiance to extinguish. The palace, once alive with laughter and soft music, had become a stage of dread, with the boy king as its sole actor and audience. Thus unfolded Edward's descent into a realm of darkness, seldom seen in one so young. His nights were haunted by the restless dance of flame upon steel, and his days consumed by the study and recreation of instruments of torment. Each scratch of quill on paper, each muffled cry in the courtyard, bound him ever tighter to a fate of tyranny. The boy who should have known the simple joys of childhood instead embraced the austere artistry of cruelty, crafting a legacy that would chill England's memory for generations. At the tender age of 10, Edward VI first dipped his quill into ink and composed fiery sermons that would soon ripple across every shire and city in England. His proclamations, delivered with a solemnity beyond his years, demanded nothing less than the utter eradication of Catholic rites and the steadfast defence of the Reformed faith at all costs. In sleepy hamlets and crowded market towns alike, parishioners awoke to banners unfurled in churchyards, bearing his edicts like heralds of divine wrath. It was as though the boy king himself had whispered through every doorstep. Any compromise with Rome was an act of sacrilege, and only unyielding obedience could secure one's soul from eternal damnation. To give force to his words, Edward erected an expansive web of religious surveillance that enshrouded the realm in an atmosphere of dread. Neighbours, once united by shared harvests and communal hymns, they were encouraged to report one another at the slightest hint of forbidden prayer. Even children were enlisted, rewarded with small coins or colourful tokens for divulging a parent's secret devotions. Royal proclamations outlined penalties for the smallest infractions, from public shaming in the village square, where offenders were bound to a pillory, to months of solitude in damp, stone dungeons, and in the gravest instances, a swift descent to the executioner's block. No gesture escaped. Notice to light a candle not blessed by the new church, to murmur a half-remembered Latin prayer under one's breath. Each could lead to a summons before the prince's tribunal. Yet Edward did not content himself with mere delegation. He took personal charge of every accusation, presiding over them in the ornate council chamber. There, seated at a long oak table, he would sift through sworn statements and depositions, his small hand guiding the feathered quill as he inscribed verdicts in his own precise script. Should a sentence strike him as too lenient a mere admonition rather than a severe penance, he would scratch through the original decree and replace it with harsher terms. In Edward's mind, mercy was no virtue but a dangerous weakness, one that threatened to unravel the very threads of divine order. He believed himself born to uphold, The first notable purge came in the bitter winter of 1548, when an abrupt wave of arrests and trials swept through the nobility. The great hall, usually alive with courtly banter and the rustle of silken gowns, fell into a grim hush as dozens of Catholic lords were brought forward. Their trials were stark affairs, a brief hearing in which each defendant pled if they dared to a crime of faith, followed by Edward's crisp signature sealing their fates. The clatter of the executioner's block and the muted gasps of onlookers echoed long after the final sentence was pronounced, weaving a chilling refrain of authority and fear throughout the corridors. Even as the condemned fell one by one, Edward observed with a composed detachment. He pressed the royal seal into the scarlet wax and watched with what appeared to be a faint, approving smile as the emblem set. Turning then to his counsellors, he handed out modest rewards, shiny coins and ribbons to the most zealous informers, lauding their loyalty as though they were knights honoured for valour in battle. Such tokens, though small, ignited a fierce competition among subjects. Citizens began to eye each other warily, uncertain whom the boy king might applaud next, and who might soon find themselves at the mercy of the bloc. Under Edward's new regime, every facet of daily life became subject to his stringent doctrine. A shepherd leading a secret midnight service, a teacher quoting an ancient psalm in hushed tones, even a merchant displaying a simple crucifix. Each act became evidence of treason against crown and creed. The machinery of persecution hummed relentlessly, its cogs fed by whispered suspicions and the bitter feuds of old village grudges. Where once laughter and melody might drift across fields at dusk, now only the heavy hush of fear filled the air, punctuated by the distant peal of chapel bells, repurposed to summon the faithful or warn the condemned. As this climate of terror took hold, England itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of a child's uncompromising will. Rumours flitted through candlelit taverns that a single murmur of dissent could draw the boy king's attention, and that even loyal subjects lived in constant anxiety of a summons to Whitehall. Nights grew sleepless for many mothers hushing their children at twilight, wary of any soft song that might be taken as an illicit hymn, farmers checking their fields at dawn, scanning the horizon for ominous riders bearing royal writs. In those darkest days, Edward's name was uttered in trembling whispers, a reminder that innocence, when forged in isolation and driven by unwavering conviction, could become the deadliest weapon of all. The boy who might have been lulled by lullabies and afternoon games had instead embraced the grim symphony of denunciation and judgment. His reign, though fleeting, wove a tapestry of dread that would leave its mark upon the nation's memory, proving that even the gentlest face can mask a resolve as merciless as iron and fire. When Edward VI reached the age of 11, a single ambition consumed him to cement his unassailable authority over every corner of England. Under his personal direction, the kingdom's religious watch grew ever more elaborate. Every whisper of unsanctioned worship, no matter how faint, was faithfully noted by trembling clerks and forwarded to the Lord of Lords for his signature. In lamplit antechambers, officers spoke in hushed tones of endless scrolls bearing hundreds of names, each a strand in the vast web of divine oversight. The soft tick of quills and the gentle rustle of parchments became the very heartbeat of a land poised under relentless surveillance. Villagers lived in perpetual anxiety. Royally appointed magistrates, their favour secured by the prince himself, launched surprise inspections at dawn. Entire communities were herded into chilly town squares for mandatory rituals, arms raised in stiff salutes of fealty. Every bowed head, every tremor of hesitation, was meticulously recorded. Those who faltered in posture, tone, or timing found their names inked into grim ledgers, awaiting the boy king's final decree. Even the breeze through narrow alleys seemed to carry a warning stray from the prescribed liturgy and invite ruin upon your soul. Edward did not merely entrust these matters to subordinates. He took the bench himself, clad in robes of midnight velvet trimmed with white ermine. He sat behind the long council table, like a dark deity presiding over fate. His eyes, half-lidded in a dreamy detachment, scanned each accusation before him with a slender silver stylus. He affirmed sentences: exile for the half-hearted believer, incarceration for those who hesitated at the threshold of orthodoxy, and for the unrepentant, the swift descent to the executioner's block. The child who once hesitated to speak now brandished every royal prerogative, with the casual confidence of one born to rule without question. Court chroniclers later recounted, with a mix of awe and horror, how Edward rewarded the most zealous young informers with glinting coins and bright ribbons. Children, once free to chase each other across open meadows, now patrolled the hearths of entire families. A single muffled prayer, a whispered Hail Mary, could earn a lad a place at the front of the prince's favour, and simultaneously mark a parent as a traitor to the crown. Thus, innocence itself was turned into a weapon of dread, as families trembled at the thought that even a trusting son or daughter might become their undoing. Within the palace's ornate walls, Edward drafted exhaustive rules governing every nuance of worship. He dictated the precise number of folds in a cleric's robes, the exact angle of genuflection before the altar, even the rhythm and volume of sacred chants. His elegant hand filled margin upon margin with measurements, a paean pronounced too loudly, or a petition uttered too softly, amounted to blasphemy. These draconian directives were compiled into official manuals and dispatched to every parish. A single misstep, an amen that lingered too long, or a kyrie that barely whispered could be cited as evidence of treason. Faith itself became a perilous labyrinth, navigated only by the trembling faithful. In mere months, England was reshaped into a vast carceral domain, from the grandest cathedral in London to the humblest cottage in Cornwall. Individual thought was crushed beneath the uncompromising shadow of Edward's true faith. Freedom of conscience vanished, replaced by the unblinking stare of churchwardens and royal constables, enforcing each rigid liturgy. Lighting an unauthorized candle became a crime punishable by public disgrace. Singing an old hymn without explicit permission merited a summons before the prince's tribunal. What was once a tapestry of diverse devotion fell into a stark, monotone scene of dread, illuminated only by the cold flames of royal will and the boy king's unwavering resolve. Even those who had backed the Regency Council found themselves bowing to Edward's youthful iron hand. The Duke of Somerset and his fellow regents, hoping for a reign tempered by reason, now cowered in the shadows of carved oak screens. To question the child, sovereign now felt akin to challenging divine ordinance. Every uttered objection bore the taint of sacrilege, and even the lightest murmur risked swift retribution. Thus the council's guiding voice was silenced, leaving Edward's edicts to stand unopposed, a testament to the transformational power of unbridled youth. As winter's frost settled over fields and villages, the world Edward fashioned stood out in bleak relief. In this kingdom, every glance exchanged on a snowy lane, every soft breath drawn beneath ice-laden boughs, fell under the boy, king's ever-hungry gaze. Mercy, once a cherished virtue, became a distant memory, an intangible dream that fluttered on the edge of extinction. In the hush of frost-bitten mornings, the pulse of fear beat steadily, echoing through the silent streets. The boy who once lingered in sunlit groves had metamorphosed into an architect of despair, proving that absolute power, once held without restraint, could warp even the purest heart into an unrelenting engine of repression. Edward's cruelty spared neither commoner nor kin. It cut deepest into his own bloodline. His elder sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, each long scarred by their father's wrath, now beheld a brother who seemed a stranger to all warmth. To Edward, Mary was the living emblem of Catholic defiance, a danger that must be extinguished, while Elizabeth existed only as a pawn, to be married off, to solidify alliances with Protestant princes abroad. He never once offered a word of sibling affection. Instead, he issued edicts confining them to separate wings of the palace, forbidding visits, intercepting letters, and stripping away the freedoms they once took for granted. When Thomas Seymour, Edward's own uncle, tried to bridge the distance with gentle gifts and whispered counsel, the boy recoiled as though repulsed by betrayal. Seymour's gestures were twisted into evidence of a plot to undermine royal authority. At Edward's command, councillors drew up charges of treason, clapped Seymour in shackles, and delivered him to the block. Witnesses later recounted in trembling whispers how the young monarch peered from a high window, eyes cold and calculating, as the axe fell. In his private journal, Edward recorded every detail: how the blade severed sinew, the precise descent of the haft, even the fleeting look of dread on Seymour's face, his detachment chilling those who had once served his grandfather. Within the palace walls, familial bonds were reshaped by doctrinal decree and absolute power. Mary was decreed a traitor to God, forced to confess sins, scripted by her own brother's hand. Her public humiliation intended to warn any who might harbour similar doubts. Elizabeth fared little better, spared death but condemned to a life monitored by guard and spy. Her every word logged for signs of disloyalty. Private conversations required the presence of attendants who noted even the subtlest inflection, ensuring that spontaneous warmth, an exchanged glance or a soft word could never take root beneath the chill of royal command. Rare were the moments Edward deigned to speak with either sister, and when he did, the encounter was a study in control. Mary would curtsy, head bowed, only to be commanded to recite passages from the New Catechism. Her voice measured against a strict standard. A stammer, a moment of hesitation, brought censure. Elizabeth, instructed to speak only when spoken to, and only in phrases pre-approved by royal decree, learned to swallow questions on her tongue. Thus, sisterly solace became a distant memory, buried beneath layers of ritual and vigilance. Each encounter a performance rather than a reunion. At the family banquet table, once a place of shared laughter and gentle jests, Edward sat like a presiding judge over two supplicants rather than siblings. Platters of fine meats and crystal goblets of spiced wine were set before Mary and Elizabeth, but the only nourishment offered was the silent lesson of obedience. Edward leaned back, his gaze half-lidded, as he observed their subdued forms under flickering candlelight, their every gesture, how they held their utensils, how they lowered their eyes at his slightest glance, served as proof of his unchallenged authority and their total submission. So the royal household transformed into a theatre of power's cruelest enactment. Mary, once hopeful of familial reconciliation, retreated into coded prayers and veiled verses, hiding her faith in the shadows of her own mind. Elizabeth, whose sharp wit had once brightened the court, found her intellect dulled by constant surveillance. Every thought sifted through the sieve of suspicion. Edward, seeing their subdued compliance, felt his conviction hardened. Isolation and fear were the surest tools to mould hearts as pliant as clay. Each whispered prayer Mary dared utter beneath her breath, each fleeting tear Elizabeth dared wipe away, only strengthened Edward's certainty that love, mercy, and kinship must forever yield to the absolute rule he enforced. Family, in his vision, was not a source of comfort, but an arena for demonstrating the infallibility of royal will. The very bonds meant to sustain the dynasty were torn asunder by doctrinal zeal and the unchecked ambition of a child king. In this bleak tableau, the future of the Tudor line appeared less a continuation of storied legacy and more a testament to the corrosive power of ideology when entrusted to untempered youth. Shared blood and common memory were severed, replaced by twin pillars of dread and compliance. And as Edward VI gazed down from his lofty perch, the chill in his heart spoke more loudly than any royal proclamation. A dread reminder that even the most sacred bonds can be snapped by unbridled ambition and unwavering conviction. A creeping illness settled into Edward VI's fragile body, yet it did nothing to dampen his zeal, in fact. It fueled an even more audacious resolve. Each laboured breath seemed to steel his determination that England must never again bow to Rome's influence. Under the soft glow of flickering candles in clandestine midnight councils, he conferred quietly with John Dudley, Earl of Northumberland, plotting to ensure a Protestant succession. Their centrepiece was Lady Jane Grey, Edward's cousin, the nexus of both Tudor lines destined to supplant Mary upon Edward's inevitable demise. In these hushed gatherings, stretching into the early hours, Edward and Dudley mapped out every facet of their coup. They hashed out the charges levied against Mary and Elizabeth, accusations of treasonous Catholic sympathies and covert pacts with foreign courts. Edward penned formal indictments brimming with scriptural references, denouncing any support for the old faith as outright rebellion against God. Missives carrying these grim declarations were smuggled through secret Protestant circles in London and the southeastern shires, rallying allied clergy for the forthcoming upheaval. As their blueprint solidified, Edward rushed to compile lists of nobles and officials to be arrested, tried, or banished. He decreed the confiscation of all Catholic estates, to be parcelled out to loyal Protestant peers. Each grant of land would require a solemn oath to uphold both the Grey succession and the Reformed Church, effectively binding their allegiance. His hurried notes even outlined the creation of a council of ardent reformers, granting them ultimate authority to enforce his doctrinal vision long after his passing. Even commoners were drawn into his scheme. Edward personally drafted pamphlets urging villagers to stand with God's chosen and renounce any suspected traitor to the true faith. These tracts, printed in small batches, were scattered at dawn markets, fluttering as a clarion call to pick a side. Though weakened by fever, the boy king brimmed with excitement at the thought that his fading life force could ignite a nationwide revolution. Night after night, from his silken bed, he studied these radical plans, fever dreams of a purified England mingling with the stark reality of his failing health. Every rustle of parchment, every whispered tactic, promised that his final breath would not mark an end, but the dawn of a new Protestant era. Even as his body betrayed him, his mind raced on drafting protocols for rounding up recusants, scripting stirring sermons, and composing ceremonial rites for Jane Grey's rise. Thus, at the edge of his mortality, Edward VI transformed from a frail child monarch into the architect of a sweeping religious coup. His anticipation pulsed through the palace like wildfire rather than slip quietly into history. He would hurl England into the purifying blaze of his unwavering faith. Whatever the cost to flesh, mind, or soul. In his final weeks, Edward VI lay ravaged by an unrelenting fever, each fitful gasp bringing rivers of blood as his body fought desperately against an invisible enemy. Yet even as delirium took hold, his mind remained ablaze with purpose. Between bouts of fevered sleep, he summoned his quill and parchment, scrawling new edicts and crafting fierce propaganda to spur on his followers. At times he would beckon earnest Protestant ministers to offer solemn prayer by his bedside. Moments later, he would rebuke them for their lack of ferocity in hunting down heretics. His once elegant hand now shook uncontrollably, margins filled with chilling promises to punish hundreds should Jane Grey's reign falter. The palace physicians, writing in hushed tones, documented the young king's agonizing decline, convulsions that twisted his frame. Skin turned a grisly hue from suspected arsenic in his treatments, and haunting visions he claimed were divine commands to purge all unbelievers. In lucid intervals, Edward would call out Mary's and Elizabeth's names, spitting curses through clenched teeth, then pause to outline in painstaking detail the spectacle of their public interrogations. He dreamed of horrifying trials staged before crushing crowds, designed to cow any would-be dissenters into obedience. Despite his weakening heartbeat, Edward pressed onward with his campaign of violence. His bedside became the nerve center for a last, desperate plot. A sealed charter would elevate Lady Jane Grey to the throne the moment his life's flame flickered out. He met in secret with John Dudley, Earl of Northumberland, whispering final instructions as candlelight danced across fever-dulled faces. Lists of recalcitrant nobles were finalized, coffers readied to bribe wavering courtiers, and encrypted letters prepared for loyal clergy across the realm, all to ensure the bloodless transition of power he had so passionately envisaged. And then came the most uncanny rites of all. Performed in the dead of night, attendants spoke in tremulous whispers of Edward, holding long conversations with the spirit of Lady Jane Grey herself, in a chamber lit only by a single, sputtering candle. The king, weak and pallid, addressed her ghost in hushed tones, beseeching her to complete the mission he could not finish in life. Draped in spectral linens, he begged for her protection of the Protestant cause, as though her silent presence could shield England from any Catholic resurgence. It was a morbid theatre of devotion. A boy, King's fevered plea for posthumous partnership in his crusade. Through those final nights, his voice echoed down empty corridors in broken prayers and fevered strategies. The child who once delighted in doctrinal skirmishes now clung to every fragment of scripture as though it were a lifeline. His agonized murmurs blended conviction with desperation. His suffering must serve a loftier purpose, the purification of the realm at any personal cost. Yet even as each shuddering breath came closer to vanishing, he refused to relinquish his violent crusade or bow to pity. The palace itself sank into a grim hush. Where once laughter had rang during morning audiences, now only silent footsteps flickered across flagstones. Servants moved like ghosts, wary of disturbing the young sovereign's final machinations. A tense stillness hung in each antechamber, as if even the walls held their breath, dreading the moment when Edward's last plans would set England aflame. On the final dawn, Edward summoned his most trusted advisers to his bedside with brittle strength. With a trembling hand, he signed the last documents, a transfer of executive powers to Northumberland, and a fervent declaration demanding unflinching support for Lady Jane Grey. His signature, a shaky scrawl against cream parchment, stood as the capstone of a reign defined by doctrinal fire and unrelenting severity. Then, as the councilmen bowed their heads, the sealed papers were whisked away in silken pouches, destined to be unleashed. The very instant Edward's last heartbeat faded. Moments later, his strength deserted him. In that vast chamber, hushed by awe and dread, the boy king drew one final, laboured breath and slipped away without fanfare. With his death, the fevered architect of a Protestant coup was no more yet. The blue-tinged corpse left behind a legacy of zealous ambition that would haunt the corridors of power for generations. Even in death, Edward's fever dream of a purified realm lived on in the crackling parchment he left in trust to Dudley. A reminder that absolute conviction, once ignited in one so young, can scorch the world it seeks to save. On the morning of the 6th of July, 1553, Edward VI exhaled his final, laboured breath. A hush deeper than any grief fell over Whitehall, as though the very stones mourned the passing of a monarch so young yet so formidable. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, holding its breath in the silent corridors and empty great halls. But scarcely had the final echo of his heartbeat died away, when the fragile tapestry of power he had woven began to unravel. John Dudley, Earl of Northumberland, tasked with overseeing the delicate handover, moved with breath-snatching haste. Within 2 days of Edward's death, the palace gates swung open to proclaim Lady Jane Grey as Queen. She was Edward's cousin, a noble Protestant woman whose heritage bridged 2 royal lines. Dawn found towns and villages stirring to the sight of banners unfurling her name. Many common folk, long conditioned to expect Mary Tudor's ascension, were caught unprepared by the sudden shift. Meanwhile, Catholic nobles hardened by years of clandestine worship and suppressed hope seized the moment. Gathering their retainers and uncertain levies, they filed into the streets of key cities, their banners aloft, their voices raised in Mary's name. Their ranks swelled rapidly. For Mary Tudor represented continuity to many a return to the old rites and familiar prayers they had been forced to abandon. In whispered meetings at manor houses and behind church doors, they vowed to restore what they deemed the rightful succession. Yet Jane's brief rule proved as ephemeral as morning mist. Before the week had turned, the currents of support for Mary surged with overwhelming force. Northumberland's hastily mustered guards, loyal though they may have been, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Jane sat upon her new throne for scarcely half a day before her supporters were scattered like dandelion seeds in a summer gale. The courtiers who had embraced Jane's cause now scrambled for safety. In the ensuing purge, those who had sworn loyalty to Edward and his chosen heir faced swift retribution. Dozens were apprehended and brought before makeshift tribunals, their trials held in grim procession through silent streets. Some were sent to the block, their heads falling under the steel blade as a stern reminder of Mary's restored authority. Others, less prominent, but no less culpable, found themselves shackled and cast into dank prison cells, left to contemplate the folly of aligning with a regime so abruptly overturned. Northumberland himself did not escape fate's harsh verdict. Once the architect of Jane's rise, he was summoned before Mary's court, stripped of rank and dignity, and condemned for treason. His execution was carried out with formal ceremony, yet beneath the pageantry lay an unmistakable sense of retribution, a warning to any who might forget that the swift currents of political fortune could vanish in a heartbeat. In the pale dawn that followed Jane's downfall, Mary Tudor, resplendent in crimson and ermine, ascended the throne as Mary I. Relief and triumph shone in her eyes as she addressed the gathered nobles and commoners alike. Yet her mercy proved conditional. She extended amnesty to those willing to renounce their allegiance to Jane and Edward's vision, inviting them back into the fold of her realm. Still, she reserved the harshest punishments for Edward's chief enforcers. Those who had overseen his brutal policies were not granted clemency, but faced the block or banishment. Though her rule began with the promise of reconciliation, Mary did not shy from confronting the architects of her brother's harsh governance. Prominent figures were swiftly removed from power, their possessions seized, their names struck from the registers of the realm, in damp dungeons and upon public scaffolds. The spectre of Edward's fanaticism was purged once and for all, a grim testament to the dangers of unchecked zeal. In the years that followed, Edward VI's short but violent reign left wounds that took generations to heal. Many who had embraced the Protestant reforms in his name found themselves yearning for the familiar solace of the old Mass and the ancient liturgies. The intricate network of informers, arrest warrants, and tribunals that had thrived under Edward was carefully dismantled. Step by painstaking step, legal commissions reviewed the edicts he had issued. Those found unjust or overly harsh were repealed or rewritten. Yet the memory of Edward's fanaticism endured. The court records and trial transcripts he had overseen, each page stained with ink and blood, served as sobering reminders of the perils inherent in placing absolute power in untempered hands. The bones of those executed, the plaques commemorating public sentences, and the lingering hush in once boisterous halls ensured that few dared underestimate the capacity for cruelty under the guise of righteous conviction. Edward's death did more than mark the end of a tragic life. It ushered in a new chapter in England's long struggle between faith and governance. His fevered final plot, the succession plan, the secret handbills, the whispered conspiracies stood as a stark lesson that even the purest intentions, when fused with absolute authority, can warp into instruments of terror. In the heart of the realm, from the grandest cathedrals to the humblest cottages, people came to understand that unchecked power, though often born of zeal, can crush the human spirit with unrelenting force. Generations hence would recall Edward VI, not simply as a boy king or a religious scion, but as a cautionary figure. In the annals of history, his name would echo as a warning that conviction, divorced from compassion, can harden into cruelty, that a child, king's heart, once guided solely by dogma, may beat no more with the warmth of humanity. Thus, the aftermath of his reign and the swift reversal that followed remained a testament to the delicate balance between faith, power, and mercy. By the dawn of the 6th of July, 1553, Mary I had already set in motion a purge of her late brother's ruthless statutes. Her freshly formed council issued an array of edicts annulling every clause of Edward's heretic suppression acts, those draconian laws designed to hunt down Catholics. Yet Mary's approach to mercy was far from simple forgiveness. With the old Inquisition courts revived, those who had inked the king's death warrants were summoned to stand trial in public squares. Night after night, torches illuminated makeshift tribunals where noblemen, judges, and bishops alike were condemned as enemies of crown and church. By midday, plumes of black smoke rose from the stakes where condemned traitors, once Edward's enforcers, were burned. Spectators, long yearning for an end to the king's terror, found themselves torn between relief and dread Mary's reprisals. Cloaked in true Catholic righteousness, proved every bit as merciless as the regime they replaced. During the first year of her reign, Mary dedicated herself to restoring the ancient splendor of the Catholic Church. Latin chants once more echoed through vaulted aisles, and processions wound through streets, bearing alabaster statues of the Virgin Mary and painted icons hidden throughout her brother's rule. Every Sunday, parishioners knelt at the altar rails, reciting prayers in a tongue many could not understand. In isolated villages, frightened families whispered of heresy charges for any who failed to comply. Clutching forbidden Protestant tracts, they dared not open. These solemn ceremonies, intended to knit the kingdom back together, instead widened old rifts. In northern counties where Protestant sympathies had taken root, small rebellions flared as farmers and weavers resisted the sudden imposition of these unfamiliar rites. Under flickering lanterns, they sang hymns of defiance until royal troops arrived at dawn, their steel pikes and armoured ranks scattering the congregations. Thus did Mary, once hailed as the restorer of tradition, earn a darker epithet. Bloody Mary murmured in fearful awe behind closed chapel doors. The vengeance of her earliest policies delivered a cruel lesson to both noble and peasant alike when state power bows solely to religious zeal. Any faction, no matter how devout, can become an instrument of oppression. Mary believed she was reviving time-honoured faith. Yet in condemning those who had enforced Edward's brutal will, she multiplied the realm's sorrow. Fathers who had merely carried out orders under duress found themselves bound to stakes in village greens. Mothers who had prayed in tears watched their children taken to plague, ridden cells for spiritual cleansing. The flames that consumed foreign priests and subversive spies also devoured the innocent scholars, gentlewomen, and wayward peasants caught in the fever of reprisal. In scorching judgment upon her brother's former allies, Mary fused justice with vengeance, teaching the kingdom that zeal unchecked by mercy can scorch even the meekest soul. By the time autumn's first leaves fell in her 4th year, the hand that once raised the crown now wielded sword and gavel with unrelenting severity. The cemeteries of London bore the silent testimony crosses, marking the graves of those who dared whisper a reformer's prayer. Men of learning, women of quiet devotion, children whose only crime was inheritance, all lay hidden beneath unmarked soil. Survivors of the fires bore scars of lost kin, their voices reduced to wary whispers. Loyalty became a code word, uttered in hushed tones. A single slip of the tongue or too hopeful glance could summon the royal retribution, still fresh in their memories. The siblings of Bloody Mary learned to cloak belief in curt bows and downcast eyes, for fear that even a spark of dissent might reignite the purifying flames. And so Mary's fleeting yet tempestuous 4-year reign inscribed itself as one of England's darkest intervals. What she sought to restore through Catholic ceremony instead propelled the realm into deeper factional hatred. Her rallying cry, "Catholic England Reborn," echoed hollow amid markets and manor houses, replaced by whispers of fear. Any unlicensed prayer, any unsanctioned gathering of the faithful, carried the risk of incineration or imprisonment. The lesson etched into England's consciousness was stark. If all authority bows only to religious orthodoxy, conviction quickly erodes into cruelty. Long after Mary I's final breath, her shadow stretched across both royal annals and tavern gossip. The fires she lit to purify the kingdom consumed more than bodies. They burned away trust, fellowship, and the fragile hope that once bound neighbour to neighbour. For the people of England, her legacy became a dire warning that retaliation, no matter how sanctified, carries a grievous cost, undermining the humanity it claims to uphold and leaving behind a land where the flicker of mercy is all too easily extinguished. Scarcely had Mary I taken the throne when she moved swiftly to dismantle her brother's draconian legacy. In a cascade of royal decrees, her newly gathered council struck down every measure of Edward's dreaded heretic suppression legislation, the very laws that had empowered mob violence against Catholics. Yet Mary's alterations went beyond simple mercy. She reinstated the old Inquisition courts, summoning to public trial those who had signed death warrants under Edward's hand, night after night. Torchlit columns of officials, formerly Edward's trusted enforcers, were marched into London's squares, beneath leaden dawn skies. Judges, magistrates, and high-ranking churchmen were arraigned for treason and heresy. By midday, pyres were built, and by afternoon, great pillars of black smoke curled upward as hundreds were burned at the stake. Watching mobs, once eager to see Edward's terror end, now felt a grim chill. A fresh tide of violence had begun. Sanctified, under the banner of restored Catholic orthodoxy, during her first year of rule, Mary devoted herself to reviving the ancient grandeur of Rome's worship. Once silent cathedrals rang again with Latin chants, and bronze statues of the Virgin Mary and richly painted icons hidden or destroyed during the Protestant reforms were solemnly returned to their places of honour. On Sundays, the faithful knelt at communion rails, uttering prayers in a tongue many understood little. In outlying hamlets, fear-burgeoned villagers whispered that to miss Mass or flout the reinstated rites was effectively to brand oneself a heretic. In the northern shires where Edward's Protestant influence had been strongest, small-scale rebellions ignited as farmers and weavers refused to renounce their old traditions. Under the flicker of lantern light, they gathered to sing forbidden hymns in barns and churchyards. But before sunrise, royal soldiers, steel melding with dawn mist, swept in to disperse the worshippers and arrest their leaders. Thus did Mary, once lauded as a gentle restorer of tradition, acquire a darker epithet. Bloody Mary murmured behind bolted doors and shuttered windows. The fierce retribution of her early years delivered a brutal lesson when the state's machinery answers solely to religious fervour. Any sect, no matter its sanctimony, can be transformed into an instrument of cruelty. Mary saw herself as a guardian of ancient piety. Yet, in staging public executions of those who had enforced Edward's harsh laws, she deepened the kingdom's wounds. Fathers, compelled to carry out Edward's grim commands, found themselves bound to stakes in village greens. Mothers huddled within their homes, only to see children seized for spiritual purification. The same flames that consumed Jesuit missionaries and foreign priests also engulfed the innocent scholars, gentlewomen, and peasants caught in the whirlwind of vengeance. In burning the very agents who had upheld Edward's tyranny, Mary wove a tapestry of reprisal so complete that few escaped its threads unharmed. By the time the leaves began to turn in Mary's fourth autumn, her hand had grown heavy with both pen and sword. Across England, the bones of the nation groaned beneath the burden of her reprisals. In churchyards, large and small, crosses marked the graves of those who had dared to whisper reform men of learning, women of quiet devotion, and children whose only fault was belonging to the wrong family. Survivors carried in their eyes the silent sorrow of families shattered by the flames. A generation learned to speak only in hushed tones of allegiance, concealing true belief behind curt bows and downcast gazes, ever fearful that a single misstep might summon the next Inquisition. And so, across just 4 tempestuous years, Mary's reign carved itself into memory as one of the most sombre chapters in England's saga. Her lofty vow to reforge unity through the majesty of Catholic ritual instead hurled the realm back into the clutches of factional hatred. The rallying cry of her administration, Catholic England Reborn, echoed hollow through market squares and manor halls, muted by the clang of armoured boots and the hush of suspicion. What had once been a vibrant mosaic of devotional expression became a monochrome landscape of dread, where the slightest breath of dissent could spark flame, and flame could devour the very soul of the land. The enduring lesson of Mary's brief but violent rule was stark when religious authority is wielded without temperance. Even the noblest convictions can curdle into a tyranny that devours the very hearts it claims to protect. Long after Mary I's final procession through the palace, her spectre lingered in both the annals of court and the whispers of taverns. The fires she rekindled to purify the realm consumed more than bodies they burned away: trust, fellowship, and the fragile hope that once bound neighbour to neighbour. For the people of England, her legacy became a warning etched in smoke and ash that vengeance in the name of faith bears a price too steep, eroding the very humanity it purports to uphold, and reminding all who came after that zeal unchecked can twist the purest devotion into instruments of unspeakable cruelty. Shortly after Mary's death, Elizabeth I ascended to the throne, inheriting a realm rent by the violent swings of her predecessors. Seeking to calm the religious storm, she convened Parliament in 1559 and secured passage of the Act of Uniformity. This statute re-established the Church of England with a carefully balanced liturgy, Latin elements, tempered by services in the vernacular. Priests were allowed to don traditional robes, provided they adhered to the newly prescribed Book of Common Prayer. Under this middle way, Catholic clergy could remain in their parishes so long as they accepted the revised rites. Elizabeth's aim was to heal the deep wounds between extreme Protestants and secret Catholics, averting a fresh outbreak of sectarian carnage. Yet even this artful compromise could not erase every embittered heart. Radical Puritans, frustrated by vestiges of papist ceremony, whispered of toppling the Queen and establishing a wholly reformed church. At the same time, clandestine Catholic factions plotted in hidden chapels, dreaming of placing Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, upon England's throne. The nation stood on a knife-edge. Fervent reformers sketched their schemes in shadowed alcoves, and covert Catholic cells marshalled sympathisers in nighttime gatherings. Though the pyres of Mary's reign were extinguished, Elizabeth's government tolerated no hint of sedition. Plotters, whether driven by religious zeal or dynastic ambition, faced swift, uncompromising justice. The Queen empowered an expanding intelligence network under the shrewd Francis Walsingham. His spies and codebreakers intercepted letters and exposed conspiracies before they could unfold. Ambassadors, secret correspondents, and double agents all fed into this unseen web. In foiling attempts to unseat her, Elizabeth safeguarded both her crown and the fragile peace between faiths. Under her vigilant watch, daily life regained a cautious calm. Town markets and parish fairs buzzed once more, and grand court entertainments restored a veneer of normalcy. Yet beneath the surface lay a persistent tension. People, mindful of recent horrors, spoke of their beliefs in hushed tones and practiced discretion when attending communion or mass. Familias preservable secret prayer books, fearful that an overheard line might draw unwanted attention from government informers. Spiritual practice continued, but under a shadow heavier than the iron gates of Newgate. Still, Elizabeth's firmness ushered in a golden age in other domains. English drama blossomed on the London stage. Voyages of discovery expanded trade routes, and a strong centralised government took root. The Queen's deft management of Parliament and her skillful alliances abroad steered the realm through wars and fiscal crises. Yet even as prosperity grew, the spectre of religious politics never fully vanished. Midweek sermons sometimes carried veiled admonitions. Wandering preachers on country greens hinted at hidden plots. Past persecutions lingered in memory, keeping the populace on edge and reluctant to declare their true convictions openly. The upheavals of the mid-16th century cast a long shadow across generations. Elizabeth's settlement provided a stable framework for worship, yet it also enshrined divisions destined to outlive her reign. Dissenters, be they Puritan or recusant, lived under the constant threat of fines, imprisonment, or worse, only slowly, through social evolution and the rise of ideas about individual rights. Did real religious tolerance emerge? It would take the bloodshed of civil wars and the philosophic arguments of thinkers in far-off lands to dismantle the last remnants of state-imposed orthodoxy. Thus, Elizabeth's era, her celebrated Golden Age, remained tinged with the anxiety born of her family's violent legacy. Her compromise quenched immediate flames, yet it deepened a wary caution among her subjects. In the quiet spaces between prayers, in the verses slipped beneath coat linings, the people of England carried the hard-won lesson of Edward's fanatic cruelty and Mary's vengeful fury, that when faith and unchecked power become one, even the noblest convictions can transform into instruments of terror. Over the ensuing centuries, laws evolved, and the state's iron grip on belief loosened. The Toleration Act of 1689 and subsequent reforms chipped away at the barriers erected in Elizabeth's name. Yet the memories of those brutal decades endured, whispered in cottages, murmured in courts, a testament to the high cost of wielding religion as a sword. Ultimately, it was only by embracing the principle of free conscience untethered from crown and scaffold that England could hope to lay to rest its ancient hostilities. And so, Elizabeth I's legacy, for all its wisdom, left behind a poignant reminder that true unity demands not only careful compromise, but the unshakable freedom to worship in peace. Ever guarded against the flame of fanaticism that once threatened to consume it all. Only in the 20th and 21st centuries did historians venture deep into the quiet stacks of the royal archives and uncover Edward VI's own furtive hand in those brittle, age-darkened volumes. There, beneath cracked seals and flaking leather, lay his personal notebook and the formal court transcripts bearing his signature. In those tremulous lines, scholars found not the likeness of a helpless child, swayed by ambitious ministers, but a young king fully conscious of his heavenly commission and fiercely determined to excise Catholicism from his lands. His fevered handwriting, though unsteady, laid out exacting instructions for interrogations, sketched instruments of punishment with chilling care, and recorded with unsettling calm the spectacles of condemned men and women, poring over entries scrawled in uneven script. Academics noted Edward's repeated invocations of divine judgment and heretical corruption. One passage describes how he timed the convulsions of a condemned priest to gauge the efficiency of certain flames. Another outlines a proposed registry to mark every suspected sympathizer. Imagining a kingdom-wide web of informers at work, these revelations have prompted modern scholars to refer to him rather half in horror as the demonic child. For the editing and embellishment of his diary leave little doubt this was no puppeteered boy but a sovereign forging his own path of terror. Psychohistorical analyses have since dug into this disturbing material, treating the diary as a case study in childhood trauma and isolation. Edward's strict separation from peers, his unrelenting regimen of adult educators, and the lack of playful companionship produced, some argue, a mind warped by intellectual overdrive and devoid of basic empathy. In comparing his writings to those of other notorious autocrats, they discover a pattern, a brilliant intellect paired with an incapacity for compassion. Where a more balanced child might shrink from another's agony, Edward's descriptions crescendo into grim satisfaction, as though cruelty were his birthright. Yet the most pressing question ignited by these archival discoveries is one of agency. How much of Edward's cruelty sprang from his own will, and how much from the machinery of regency that enveloped him? It is unquestionable that the council, first under Somerset, later under Northumberland, supplied the bureaucratic horsepower for repression. Still, the personal records make clear that Edward did more than passively assent. He actively shaped each decree. He was known to review tribunal minutes personally, crossing out sentences he deemed too mild, and endorsing new clauses to intensify punishment. In doing so, he shattered any remnant of the myth that he was merely a figurehead. This deeper look at Edward's short tenure has already shifted the landscape of Tudor historiography, where once the focus lay squarely on the regent's miscalculations. Contemporary works now emphasize Edward's own driving fervour. New monographs detail how he demanded zeal from his tutors, how he kept daily lists of those to be cleansed, and how he preserved, in notebook margin sketches, the final cries of the condemned. His reign, once dismissed as the product of elder schemers, now emerges as a window into the mind of a boy king who wielded terror as both weapon and masterpiece. Decades beyond his premature death, Edward's shadow lingers in the archive's hush. Students of history, flipping through his quaking drafts and sealed mandates, confront a disquieting portrait, a sovereign too young to temper his zeal with mercy, yet old enough in conviction to see violence as holy duty. These truths do not absolve the council of wrongdoing. They bear responsibility for carrying out his commands. But they compel us to acknowledge Edward himself was the architect of much of the mayhem that befell England. Even as new biographies recalibrate our understanding of mid-Tudor politics, the recovered documents serve as a cautionary testament that authority, even vested in a child, can birth untold horrors. In the candlelit quiet of archival rooms, one hears Edward's quill scratch across his last pages, an echo of fanatic resolve that refused to yield to illness or childhood. For the modern reader, his own words stand as proof that tyrants need no shield, but their own unchecked ambition. Ultimately, the ongoing reconsideration of Edward VI's reign offers a broader lesson in the complexity of power. It reminds us that while regents and ministers shape policy, it is the sovereign's heart, no matter how youthful, that animates the machinery of the state. Through his private confessions and public decrees, Edward emerges not as a pawn in a grand political game, but as a fervid participant in history's darkest hour. The lesson he leaves for future generations is stark, absolute conviction, when wielded by any single soul, can twist even the promise of salvation into a forge of unholy cruelty. Edward VI's all-too-brief reign paints a chilling portrait of what can occur when instruction degrades into mere repetition of dogma and when absolute authority is entrusted to an inexperienced child. In Edward's England, every royal edict was proclaimed as God's own will, and any hint of dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. His upbringing consisted of incessant lectures on divine right and sermons on monarchical supremacy, delivered by tutors who saw little value in play or companionship. Bereft of the simple kindnesses that define childhood shared laughter, spontaneous games, affectionate embraces, the young king's soul hardened. The resulting fanaticism, fueled by textbooks and tyrannical absolutes, found its expression in a machine of governance that ground people's lives into dust. The tragic irony is that a mind so young, brimming with intellectual brilliance, became the engine of merciless persecution simply because its education lacked balance and its power lacked restraint. This cautionary tale compels us to reconsider the very roots of how we nurture young minds. The greatest risk in shaping future generations lies not only in the concentration of political or spiritual power, but in divorcing that power from genuine human connection. When curricula emphasize abstract doctrine over empathy, when classrooms foster competition at the expense of collaboration, and when emotional intelligence is sacrificed to the altar of test scores, we run the risk of producing individuals who grasp the mechanics of authority, yet remain strangers to compassion. Edward's story may be a historical outlier, but it underscores a universal truth. An education stripped of warmth and social interaction can yield what might be termed a chilled intellect, precise, unflinching, and all too willing to dehumanize those it judges. Imagine, by contrast, a more rounded upbringing. A boy of 9 whose days include hearty laughter with peers, the gentle soothing of a mother's lullaby, and the innocent delight of chasing butterflies in sunlit meadows. Such experiences, though seemingly small, imbue a child with vital emotional ballast. They teach the value of kindness, the beauty of shared discovery, and the understanding that life's richness lies not solely in knowledge but in connection. Had Edward known the joy of unstructured play, the comfort of true friendship, or the vulnerability of shared secrets, his formidable intellect might have been tempered by empathy. Instead, each lesson he received reinforced the notion that power meant dominion, that mercy was weakness, and that human lives were expendable in service of a purer kingdom. Equally vital is the lesson regarding checks and balances. No matter how exalted the office be it king, president, or CEO, unchecked power invites disaster. Edward's single signature could seal a person's fate. His directives spurred networks of surveillance and secret tribunals that destroyed countless lives. This reveals the darker side of concentrated authority when one individual's will is unopposed. The machinery of the state can become an instrument of cruelty rather than protection. Robust institutions, independent judiciaries, transparent législature, an unfettered press, and civil society watchdogs serve as the bulwark against such overreach. When these mechanisms function properly, they diffuse power, encourage débat, and provide avenues for redress. But when they falter, as they did under Edward's regents, and later in his own hands, a single ruthless whim can consign thousands to suffering. From Edward's reign arises a dual imperative for any society committed to both freedom and well-being. First, we must build educational systems that harmonize rigorous intellectual training with emotional and social development. Classrooms should teach critical thinking alongside cooperation, logic alongside kindness, and debate alongside listening. Children deserve mentors who nurture their curiosity and guide their moral growth as attentively as they instruct in scripture or science. Second, we must design political and organizational structures that prevent any one person from wielding unchecked control. Power must be dispersed through clear legal frameworks, periodic review, and mechanisms for accountability. Only by coupling humane education with institutional checks can we hope to cultivate leaders who respect the humanity of those they serve and whose decisions are grounded in both wisdom and compassion. In every corner of history, from ancient empires to modern democracies, the echoes of Edward VI's tragedy remind us that power without warmth corrodes the soul, and conviction without balance devours both the wielder and the victim. When we educate, let us remember that nurturing the heart is as crucial as enlightening the mind. When we govern, let us ensure that no one stands above scrutiny. By embracing these lessons, humanizing our schools, and reinforcing our systems of accountability, we stand the best chance of preventing the rise of another ruler whose divine ambition, left unchecked, becomes a nightmare for all beneath their crown. Edward VI's fleeting 6-year stint on the English throne may seem but a brief flicker in the long sweep of history, yet its implications resonate with haunting force even today. His ascent at the tender age of 9, under the tutelage of zeal-imbued tutors and shielded from the ordinary joys of childhood, set the stage for a drama in which unchecked authority entwined with rigid ideology would consume both the young sovereign's own humanity and the very fabric of the society he ruled. In Edward's case, the sacred justification of every royal command, presented as an unquestionable divine mandate, allowed no room for compassion or dissent. Consequently, his administration became a mechanized engine of persecution, grinding mercilessly onward until fear and suspicion ran like quicksilver through every village and court. From the moment he donned the crown, Edward's education was an unrelenting diet of doctrinal lectures and dogmatic enforcement. Latin verses, extolling the divine right of kings, replaced playground laughter. Theological polemics stood in for fairy tales, and the notion of mercy was dismissed as a betrayal of heavenly purpose. Left bereft of the simple warmth of child-to-child camaraderie, or the gentle solace of maternal affection, the boy, King's psyche hardened. In this starved emotional ecosystem, his intellectual gifts, once a source of wonder, became instruments of ruthless governance. When instruction in scripture and statecraft excludes the nurturing of empathy, it risks forging minds adept at command but stranger to the plight of the governed. Edward's diary entries, preserved on trembling parchment, reveal a ruler who measured the efficacy of torture as clinically as a scholar might record an astronomical observation. The innocence of a child, corrupted by isolation and absolute power, gave way to a stark fanaticism that thrived on intimidation. Yet Edward's case, though extreme, underscores a universal pitfall. Any system, whether religious, political, or educational, that concentrates power and suppresses critical thought can quickly warp into an apparatus of oppression. In such an environment, intellect becomes a blade honed to cut down dissent, and authority, no matter how well-meaning at its inception, can devolve into cruelty when untempered by human connection. The lesson we must draw is clear: education ought to build more than intellectual acuity. It must also cultivate the heart. Curricula that emphasize only abstract theory, drills in doctrine, and the mastery of authoritative texts risk producing graduates who understand how to wield power but lack the moral compass to wield it justly. Genuine learning incorporates collaborative projects, peer discussions, role-playing that fosters empathy, and opportunities for students to experience and reflect on real-world challenges together. Only in this balanced soil can knowledge and compassion take root side by side, ensuring that the next generation of leaders will carry both wisdom and warmth. Equally vital is the necessity of checks and balances. Absolute power vested in any single individual inevitably tempts that person toward excess. Edward's sole signature could literally sentence men and women to death. His decrees spawned surveillance networks that turned neighbors into informers, and his personal involvement in planning coups demonstrates how swiftly one unopposed voice can plunge an entire nation into turmoil. To avert such calamity, societies must establish robust mechanisms to distribute and monitor authority. Independent judiciaries, free presses, parliamentary oversight, and transparent budgetary processes all serve to dilute concentration of power. Furthermore, a culture of civic engagement, where citizens feel both empowered and responsible for speaking out, forms an additional layer of defense against unbridled despotism. When any official act is subject to scrutiny, debate, and legal review, the temptation to wield power arbitrarily is greatly diminished. Taken together, these insights yield a twofold imperative for every community seeking to preserve both freedom and justice. First, educational systems must be designed to foster not only intellectual prowess, but also emotional intelligence and social solidarity. Schools should teach students how to think critically and act compassionately, how to challenge assumptions while respecting the dignity of others, and how to balance personal ambition with the common good. Second, pour institutions politiques, corporate, religious must be structured so that no single person or faction can command unchallenged authority. Power must be parceled out, subject to procedural checks, and ultimately beholden to the will of the people through regular, free, and fair elections or analogous methods of accountability. In the hushed corridors of collective memory, where Edward VI's quivering script still survives on yellowing pages, we encounter an unvarnished reminder. The cruelty of bureaucratic tyranny often springs from the vacuum created when empathy is absent and power is absolute. Yet by weaving compassion into education and embedding restraint into governance, we can resist that siren call of untempered authority. In doing so, we honor the unintended legacy of a tragic child king, one who, in his zeal to purify his realm, illustrates the paramount importance of balancing intellect, power, and compassion. Let Edward's story stand as both warning and guide that true leadership requires not only clarity of purpose, but warmth of spirit, that societies flourish not when they bow unquestioningly to any single voice, no matter how exalted, but when they embrace diversity of thought and foster mechanisms to hold power to account. Only then can we ensure that the righteous flame of conviction illuminates rather than incinerates human dignity, and that our shared humanity remains unextinguished amid the trials of governance. Edward VI's brief tenure on the throne, no more than a fleeting 6 years, offers an enduring cautionary tale: absolute power, cloaked in divine prerogative, devastates both the ruler's humanity and the health of society. Thrust into sovereignty at 9, Edward's education was reduced to relentless theological drills and monarchical propaganda, with no room for friendship, play, or maternal solace. Bereft of emotional connection, the boy, king's extraordinary intellect, became a tool of oppression, enabling him to issue death sentences as casually as reciting a lesson. His reign vividly demonstrates how the fusion of raw authority and doctrinal rigidity, without the counterbalance of empathy, can transform innocence into fanaticism. From this stark example emerges our first vital lesson: education must never divorce intellectual rigor from human warmth. A system that prizes abstract theory above kindness, that values obedience over curiosity, will spawn individuals who understand how to command, but remain strangers to compassion. Instead, full-bodied learning embraces peer collaboration, emotional literacy, community service, and the nurturing of moral judgment. In such an environment, future leaders learn not only to think critically, but also to feel deeply and act justly. Equally compelling is the necessity of checks on power. Edward VI's unchecked signature could doom hundreds. His secret surveillance and coup plotting show how easily a single voice can wreak havoc when unopposed. Whether in medieval courts or modern governments, absolute authority presents a profound danger. To guard against it, societies must build robust institutions, independent judiciaries, transparent législature, free media, and empowered civil society watchdogs. When power is distributed and accountability is enforced, the impulse toward tyranny is restrained. Thus, Edward VI's legacy issues a dual mandate for our time: to cultivate humane, well-rounded education, and to erect ironclad safeguards around every locus of authority. Achieving these goals demands courage and sustained effort from educators who champion both mind and heart, and from citizens who insist on participatory governance. Only through a marriage of empathy in learning and vigilance in oversight can we prevent the rise of another child despot. Regardless of age or era, may Edward's story serve as our beacon, reminding us that true progress requires not just brilliant ideas, but the shared humanity to guide their application, that societies flourish only when power is balanced by compassion, and that conscience, not coercion, must remain the guiding light of civil life.